Or for an official start. Oh my goodness.
Yes, we're going to officially move from the unofficial to the official and officially dive in to session 5 of our Thought Leader Conversations. Welcome, everyone. For those who don't know me, I'm Lisa Fain, CEO of Center for Mentoring Excellence. I want to welcome Chad Littlefield. I'm so excited to welcome Chad today. I've been a fan for many years. I had the privilege early on when I had just really started in this business of attending one of Chad's workshops and have followed him, and we've become friends since then. So very excited, Chad, to have you. Chad's the co-founder of We and Me. Forbes calls Chad a global expert on asking questions that build trust and connection. Really, what could be important when it comes to mentoring and building trust and connection. Chad's a TEDx speaker, best-selling author, and the creator of We Connect cards, which is a tool that's now being used in over 80 countries to create conversations that matter. Chad and his company's late co-founder, Will Wise, wrote the book Ask Powerful Questions, which is a #1 best-selling book in 4 different categories on Amazon. He's brought his workshops, ideas, and interactive keynotes to Crayola, JetBlue, Johnson & Johnson, Starbucks, and dozens of top universities, even the CIA, but he can't talk about it. Please join me in welcoming Chad Littlefield. Hi, Chad.
Hello. I'm glad this is recorded so I can send that to my mom. It makes me sound interesting. I'm excited to chat.
So let's just start off. You've often said that your mission is to eliminate small talk. So I'm wondering how that became important to you and what impact you think it's going to have to eradicate small talk.
Yeah. Before anybody gets too angry, I'll clarify that for me, small talk has nothing to do with the content of a conversation. It has to do with the process. And so I have had a conversation about the weather that I would absolutely put in the category of conversation that mattered deeply. It happened to be with a man named Eugene Clodio, who is a meteorologist, and we were studying seasonal affective disorder. But the idea is, like, you can talk about the weather if the process, if you're really curious about it, if it matters, et cetera. And so I got clear a few years ago on this kayak camping retreat in the middle of nowhere, Maine. And the intention was to kind of disconnect from the world, reconnect with yourself, and some higher purpose, if you believe there even is one. And very much to my surprise on that trip, I got really crystal clear language that was, Chad, you exist to gently eradicate small talk and create conversations that matter. And after that, all these like little flashes of notable historical figures showed up for me. And so can you imagine like Buddha or Gandhi or Rosa Parks or Jesus or anybody else who like has made history in some way, walking up to you and saying, "How was your weekend?" I'm sure they did it, right? I'm sure that all of them at some point asked a question like that. But I think the people in my life who like really change things and shift things have a way of cutting to the heart of what matters. And so, a mentor of mine, Jeff, 15 minutes before I got married, walked straight up to me, no niceties, no hellos, put his hand on my shoulder and just said, "Are you present? Because you really don't want to miss your own wedding." And 10 years ago, I'm really glad he did that because I was actually there. And so I think a couple, to answer your question, like specifically and concretely, I think we could probably double the amount of good stuff that happens in the world if we cut out like idle chit chat just because. Now, I still think you can ask, how are you? What do you do? Where are you from? All these questions and have it matter. But I think it's also interesting to note, like we get in such a routine with the questions we ask that just by disrupting those questions a little bit, we tend to ask better questions because they're more intentional, they're more thoughtful. We're not just like plugging the cassette in and just letting the tape play. And when we move off of autopilot, that's useful.
I'm really curious about the role of trust in eradicating small talk, right? Because if you hadn't met me and I came up to you 10 minutes before your wedding and said, "Are you present?" You're like, "You're in my way. I'm on the way to the runway. Get out of the way," right? So curious your thoughts about that.
So let's go back to that scenario. Let's pretend we hadn't met, which we hadn't 10 years ago. And let's pretend you crashed my wedding and you walked up to me. I think it's an interesting hypothetical experiment to think about. How could you ask that same question and have it be received well? It's just an interesting thought experiment. And I wonder, and this is what the first chapter of Ask Powerful Questions focuses in on, is being clear about your intent and sharing it with the person that it affects. And so if you didn't know me and you crashed my wedding and you walked up to me and you said, hey, I recognize I've got a question for you. And I recognize it's a little bit strange because we haven't met yet. But when I got married, it was really, really useful when somebody else asked me this question. Can I ask it? Right. So I've like shared a really clear intent. It's framed in the benefit of the other. And I've also sought consent. And all before I asked that bigger question. And so if you do those things, what might happen is they choose to not play the game and they're like, no, please don't ask me this question. Or they choose to like curl up or back off in some way.
Yeah.
But I think people are more willing to answer difficult, unusual, curiosity-based questions if you're clear about your intent and you ask them for permission first. So that said, yeah, it's a lot easier to just go for it if you have a relationship of trust already established with somebody, but being clear about your intent and seeking their permission builds trusts as quick as I know how. Because you're not going to like walk up to somebody and read them your bio and be like, see, I'm not a serial killer.
Yeah. Context is everything, isn't it? Right. I mean,
Yep.
really understanding that context is really important.
Yep.
I learned a concept from you that I have implemented and asked all of the facilitators who are associated with Center for Mentoring Excellence to implement. And it's really been a game changer for us. It's connection before content. So I would love for you to just share what is connection before content and what can mentoring partners do in that context, in the context of mentoring to create connection before content.
Yeah, so I originally read this phrase from Peter Block, and so I'd like to think I like got this phrase and then packed a whole bunch of other practical ideas around it. And so a couple distinctions first. Connection before content is not like, if you need somebody to send you a document, it's not walking into their office and being like, hey, how was your weekend? How are the kids? Oh, by the way, can you send me the document? That is not connection before content. The idea is, can we take a moment to connect with each other? Number one. Number two, connect to the purpose of why we're actually there. And number three, whatever that connection before content initiative or effort is, does it create the option or choice for authenticity and vulnerability? And if you do anything that meets those three criteria, connect people to each other, connect people to the purpose of why they're actually there, and creates the option or choice for authenticity and vulnerability, which is really like, do you give people the option to tell the truth, right? If you do anything that meets those three criteria, in my book, it would fall into the category of connection before content. And the impact of that is immense. It creates lots of communication shortcuts. It tells people your perspective is actually valued here. And I'm not just going to ram my perspective or shove my perspective in your face, right? And so there's some really fun research that was done at Johns Hopkins that Priya Parker shared in her book, The Art of Gathering. And at Johns Hopkins, they wanted to reduce the amount of medical errors and deaths that were happening, particularly amongst surgical teams. And so like, you don't want gauze sewn up in your leg if you get a knee replacement. You want all the gauze to leave. And so they tried all these different interventions to figure out like, how do we reduce medical errors and deaths? And the number one intervention that worked best and reduced medical errors and deaths by 35% was everybody who was on the surgery that day stood in a circle and just said their name and their role and if they had any concerns for the surgery that day. That alone. So I would say that is connection before content that's maybe a little weak on the connecting to each other piece, but really well connected to the purpose and creates an open place for people to share something that's true for them. And so from, the tech, that was a moment for the tech to speak up in front of the surgeon. And that is important to level that playing field, and connection before content tends to level that playing field really well.
Yeah. So let's take that to the mentoring context, right?
Yeah.
Because, sometimes when I mentioned connection before content to mentors and mentees, they're like, look, we only got an hour. We got goals we got goals to set. We got a lot to talk about. I don't got time for connection. What would you say to that, Chad?
Phooey. Yeah. And so, I mean, try to help someone accomplish their goals without knowing them. So I was talking, I'm exploring doing some work with the Association for School Social Workers, and they're doing a lot of putting a lot of effort toward belonging right now. And so if you want a mentor or mentee to match and to last and to sustain past some like forced structure, which maybe you don't want to do, but if you do want to do that, if you actually want to create a relationship that both parties want to show up, you have to create some belonging. And for me, belonging, I would define by, it's when somebody's seen, heard, and understood and accepted for who they are and who they are not. If you don't connect before content in a mentoring relationship, people can't be seen, heard, understood, or accepted because you don't know who they are and who they are not. And so it's important to spend a little bit of time to connect with that human being before you jump into anything that's human doing related. And so goals, objectives, etc., would fall into that category. Now, that said, my wife, Kate, is a school nurse, busy, got to do stuff, doesn't have a lot of time, but her regular med kids know that when they come down to the office, she has a deck of these We Connect cards, question cards on her desk, and her regular med kids know that they can pick a question to answer, and they can pick a question for her to answer. It takes about 2 to 3 minutes, which is enough time for her to spare. And one result of that is she's got one student in particular, but many students like to go down and visit her, but one student in particular sprints to her office every single day because that's his moment to be seen, heard, and understood. And so in a mentor-mentee relationship, she's not necessarily in a mentor relationship, but my goodness, if we can have mentees running into a call metaphorically, that's what we want, because that's how they're going to get a lot out of it. That's where they're going to ask questions. That's where the mentor is not going to have to do like a heavy lift to drive the conversation, because they're excited, they're ready, they're there to contribute. That tone is set.
Yeah, I love that.
I'm only mildly passionate about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, and just from my perspective, just to build on that, Chad, is also that if you're wanting to come up with, to problem solve together, to co-create in the mentoring relationship, whatever the outcome is that works for the mentee, to really understand each other is going to help you come up with all sorts of hypotheticals to identify where potential roadblocks are. And without that connection, you miss that whole piece, and it becomes much more transactional. So
much more transactional, and also it allows you, I've been thinking a lot about prompt engineering with the rise of AI, and how the prompts we prompt in artificial intelligence really matter, but they matter just as much, maybe even more, for human intelligence, because humans have feelings and emotions and whatnot. And so the ability for a mentor to ask a really pointed, relevant question that is the question that might make a difference for a mentee, it really helps to have some context about who the person is, right? If I let's do this. If I just held up a picture and said, "This is your mentee, Lisa, ask them a question." Well, let's go for it.
Yeah. Okay. What's it like to eat food that's suspended from trees that people are counting on?
I love it. So now let me tell you that this is actually Michaela, and Michaela is a bear that lives up in Alaska and has been helping researchers to meet other bears. Michaela actually speaks English. She's able to talk to the researchers and tell them where to go to meet other bears. It's now ask this bear a question.
Yeah, I mean, tell me about the impact, right? Right? Yeah, fantastic.
A playful example, right? If you got 42 facts about a person and some context about who they are, your questions just get better. Inherently, they get better, they get more relevant. The people answering them care a bit more.
Yeah, fantastic. Fantastic. I learned a word. I've been doing a lot of work with some folks in the military, and they taught me the term foot stomping. So if you foot stomp on something, it's instead of piggybacking, it's if you want to emphasize or agree with wholeheartedly, you're foot stomping on something. So a big foot stomp to that one.
I love it.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's just talk about kind of connecting. It's easy to connect with can be easier to connect with somebody when you feel like you have an affinity towards them, or you feel like you might like them. But how do you connect because this happens often in mentoring relationships. How do you connect with someone you don't know, or maybe you don't even think you like?
So I love this question, and let's do this. So you just asked the question. I feel like this could be a perfect time. Instead of usually what we do is Q and then my answer.
Yeah.
Let's do a Q and A and A and A and A and A. And so if everybody could take 30 seconds, I'm going to see if I can actually draw out a little answer to my question. But if everybody can take 30 seconds and answer that question for themselves in the chat, or answer the question themselves from their own perspective in the chat. So in theory, in 30 seconds to a minute, the chat will be filled with a goldmine of useful ideas and perspectives from the group. And then I'll offer my perspective. Let's actually take a minute to answer this. So Lisa, if you want to re-ask your question, and then everybody here, assuming you're not driving, please don't get in a car accident. Assuming you're not driving, go ahead, jump in the chat and answer this question as if you were the one being interviewed, and then I'll toss in my answer at the end of this timer. How's that sound?
So in the workplace and often in mentoring relationships, we've got to connect with someone we don't know, or maybe we don't even like. How do we do that? How do we connect with someone we don't know, maybe even don't like?
All right. So I'm going to rapid fire read everybody else's responses so that I can stand on the shoulder of giants as I show you my really ridiculous picture. And this will make sense in a minute, but here is my drawing of how to interact with people you don't know or don't like. So first, finding the commonality, Naya, find something we have in common and elevate that. Do you have that in common, Dennis and Naya? You both shared the same response. Mark, you also have that in common because you also said find commonalities. Share something about ourselves first to be vulnerable. Lisa, I love that because I have a good friend who I used to work with named Kalen, and he used to say that a conversation without self-disclosure is an interrogation. So, you know, a good way to make someone not like you more is to interrogate them. And so the idea of like being vulnerable, sharing a piece of yourself and your truth, it's hard to argue when you share just something that is true for you. I don't mean like an opinion necessarily, but like an experience that's happened to you, or a perspective, or the way that you grew up. Like somebody that you don't like is not going to argue with you about how your dad raised you or didn't raise you, right? It's like, that just is what it is. It's a bit unarguable. Although I know some people that I'm sure would try. Meet over coffee first, be curious about differences. Michelle, I love that one because I think that oftentimes we assume that connection equals commonality, and we forget that curiosity can really simply or really easily turn difference into connection. Like some empathetic curiosity allows us to take difference and like whoop, change it into a connection. So like, I didn't grow up in New Jersey, but when I find out somebody did, I can either say, oh, I didn't grow up there, or I can say, what was it like growing up in Trenton, right? And I can seek a little bit more understanding there. And then, wow, there's a lot of really good perspectives. For those of you watching a recording, you just had to be here live to get the rest of the 20 responses that are really beautiful. Here's my response. I used to work for an organization called World in Conversation, and the whole premise of the group was to get people to sit down in a circle, strangers, to talk about stuff, really soft, fluffy topics like race relations, long-term conflict, politics, gender, sexuality, religion, etc., for 90 minutes. And their mission was actually to transform conflict into collaboration. And there was a quote hanging on the wall from Abraham Lincoln. there's your picture of Abraham Lincoln. There's a quote from Abraham Lincoln that said, I don't like him. I need to get to know him better.
Mm.
And for years, I loved that quote. I was like, oh, this is such an inspiring quote. It's motivating for me when somebody is annoying or frustrating, or for whatever reason I don't like, or I'm not clicking with them. I don't know them. I need to get to know them. I don't like them. I need to get to know them better. Now, I'll just to end on a funny note, I will say that idea was shattered a bit when I saw the rest of that quote, which was in the context of, I believe said in the context of like military. And it was, I don't like them. I need to get to know them better so that I can destroy my enemy.
Oh,
it's
boy.
like, ooh, that changes the quote a little bit. While like a humorous end, I do actually think that that is a line that we have to toe, and a reason some people may not want to be vulnerable. There is risk inherent in vulnerability, and people like who have had their trust broken or have been exploited in some sort of way in the past, the idea of being vulnerable isn't real attractive. And so, yeah, just like being really mindful of that balance. So all that said, my insight would be the first part of the quote: get to know them better. If you don't like them, get to know them better. Because I think typically when you get to know people enough and enough of their contexts and some of the things that trigger you in whatever way that is, tend to fade away or get situated and put in a box of like, right, I have a friend who is amazingly loud. It is so embarrassing to go out to dinner with them. He is so loud, very, very fun. One of my best friends, but so unbelievably loud. But his father, as he was growing up, was really hard of hearing. And so he learned his decibel level just had to be up here if he wanted to be heard. And for better or worse, that just never went away. And so I feel less embarrassed when I go out to eat with him because I know that about who he is and how he grew up. I got to know him better a little bit.
Yeah, it helps you take the judgment out of it, right? It helps you take that judgment out of it. I love the concept somebody raised in the chat about being vulnerable too, because there's a concept that I often talk about, this like being the first mover. And it's sort of the opposite of the Pacific Northwest stop sign. You know what happens at a Pacific Northwest stop sign, Chad?
I don't.
Okay. So this is coming from an East Coast, a girl from the East Coast who now lives in the Pacific Northwest. At a Pacific Northwest stop sign, everybody comes up to the stop sign, no matter who got there first. Everybody comes up to the stop sign and looks at each other and goes, you go, you go, you go, you go, you go. And nobody wants to go until somebody steps on the gas and goes, and then everybody else will flip off the person who went through the stop sign, right? And so it's sort of the opposite of this move first concept, right? Of like, if you really want to kind of create connection, it's the opposite of a Pacific Northwest stop sign. It's that somebody's got to go first. Somebody's got to go first and be vulnerable first to create that connection, to create that knowing, so you can really be curious and move forward. So that's great. And I love the comments in the chat. What we'll do is save the chat, and when we send out the recording, if folks want to take a look at the chat, they can have those comments as well. But come live next time so you can share as well. All right, I'd love to hear about your own experience with mentoring, Chad. You mentioned some of the mentors in your career. I'd love to hear about a particularly notable mentor and what you learned from that person and the difference they made.
Yeah, it's interesting. I got about 2.5 years ago, I started publishing very regular YouTube videos, and there's 400 or 500 videos up now. And if on the document where I plan and outline my videos, if I did a Command F search, like a Control Find search for the word mentor, it would probably show up 800,000 times because in that document, right, I realized as I was watching back a couple of videos recently that I think in every single video, I share something that begins, and the sentence begins with "a mentor once shared with me," or a time about an interaction, a conversation, a meal with a mentor. And so, yeah, it's been, if you ask me the short version of my story of how I wound up here, I could probably just give you 4 or 5 people's names. There are people that like revealed a path that I didn't even know existed that allowed me to walk. Now, your question was, how did I find them? Mm-hmm. several of them I cheated and met them in college. And I say cheated because it's like, it feels so much easier to meet a mentor when you're a student, because everybody around you wants to support and uplift you. And so I used to tell students that, like, if you reach out to people who you think won't respond now when you're a student, the chances that they respond are way higher than they will be the minute you graduate. The minute you take a role as like sales director at Salesforce or wherever else, you're like, your chances of them responding go way down, in part because there's this like barrier up of like, what does this person want out of this conversation? Whereas a student, the intention is actually like transparent or obvious. So that's it. As a student, I was taking intro to counseling class, and one of my professors, Jeff, who at my wedding asked me, "Are you present?" Just mentioned offhand in a 50-minute lecture in a class of 120 people, just mentioned this dream that he had offhand. He didn't say really much about it, but he alluded to the fact that it was quite significant for him. And after class, the way that he tells the story is, after class, I was the only one out of 120 people that walked up and was like, "Can I ask a little bit more about that dream?" And that led to that dream related to something that was really important to him, a practice in his life that also related to meditating. And so we ended up meditating just about weekly for the next 5 or 6 years or something. Not like I asked a question and then we started meditating weekly. Like, had a few conversations in between. He became my advisor. We did some research together on social anxiety, yada, yada, yada. Recently, though, I went through and actually drew a little timeline of, and I'm not particularly old, but I drew a little timeline of my life and journey of how I got here, focused on the conversations that I had with people. And every single one of the mentors was like, it was rooted in a question that I was curious about, that I saw them present or share something, and I used my feet or my fingers and followed my curiosity. Fingers meaning on my keyboard, followed my curiosity and asked a question. And so if you want to find a mentor, find something you're naturally, genuinely curious about and ask that person a question, intending to just learn something right away in that moment. And so in other words, like, I didn't ask them to be a mentor. I asked them to mentor me right then by answering my question. And so it was like, cool, we just had 10 minutes of mentoring. Can we do it again? Can we do another 10 minutes at the end of the next class or at the end of the next thing? And so it's incremental. I think there's probably other smarter formal ways. That's just the way that I have found my own mentors.
I think that's spectacular. And, there's a couple nuggets in there that I just want to foot stomp on, to use the term I just said, which is, one is that I have a colleague named Ruth Gauthier who wrote an article in Forbes magazine that said, don't use the M word, mentor, right, when you first approach somebody. Instead, be curious about something, establish a relationship. And then what I hear you saying, Chatter, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is something that developed into more of a mentorship and really started with an initial conversation. So, I think that that's really, really, really important. And you had mentoring moments that ended up turning into a mentoring relationship. And, remembering that it doesn't necessarily have to be a formal mentoring relationship at the beginning, but some of those mentoring moments can happen pretty organically is really important too.
Yeah. And I'll throw out one, ironically, from a mentor, one tool that I learned on how to create those mentoring moments on repeat, especially in the very digital world that we live in. I had never heard of this concept of a spear email. So the idea of a linear email is like long, interesting, not expecting a reply. So that's like a newsletter as a linear email. It's one way. Next, spear email is something that is short. This is not the way you write an acronym, is it? Short, personal, expecting a reply. And so the amount of the idea of not using the M word, like, can you be my mentor? That might be short to respond to, but it's certainly not a short commitment. Like, that's not a small commitment to say yes to that. And so the idea of, like, right now, if you want to find somebody to be mentored by, I would go on LinkedIn, search for things that you're interested in. I'd click open the tabs of 10 people's profiles. I'd look through the profiles, find something I was naturally, genuinely curious in, and I would send them a message rooted in that curiosity, solely intended to invite their perspective on that particular thing. Maybe I get a response out of 5 to 8 people, because when it turns out when you ask for people's advice, they're usually pretty happy to share it. It's one of the reasons, Lisa, these conversations probably work for you. It's like, hey, want to hop on and just share your perspective for an hour? I was like, yeah, sure. Sounds good. And so if you do that in miniature versions, people are usually pretty open to that too, which is, yeah, easing your way into mentoring.
It's a great tool. It's a great tool. All right. So the term icebreaker, some people are like icebreaker and some people are like icebreaker, right? What makes it great and what makes it fail? And how do you think mentoring pairs can use icebreakers to create connection when it's not a big group, but it's really usually 2 people?
Yeah. So first of all, I'd say that icebreaker usually is in a way that makes people cringe is usually used in a group context. Now that said, I don't know this is like the wisest place for me to plant my flag, but I have planted my flag in the world, and I get into plenty of fights with people on the internet about my mission to delete the word icebreaker from our lexicon. And the reason I get into fights with people about it is like, it's a common word. Everybody knows it. It's like, why do we need to replace it with a phrase like connection before content or something else? And it's like, it's a common word that means a lot of different things. I've participated in an icebreaker before, true story, that somebody had us pair up with somebody, agree on an animal sound that we would make, then go far away, separate in another room. They blindfolded us and said, find your partner using only your animal sound. And it's like, I'm not sure that allowed us to connect to each other, connect to purpose, or create the option or choice for authenticity and vulnerability, right? Like checked 0 of those boxes or the criteria for me for connection before content. And so that said, I'm sure that many, many people have said, let's do an icebreaker. And they led something that was beautiful and right on par with connection before content and met all 3 of those criteria. And not that many people cringed. So, choose your words wisely. But my hope actually by deleting that word is actually just by making the idea of human connection a little bit more intentional and a little bit less mandatory. So one of the things that really grinds my gears is when somebody says, before we get started, we're going to do an icebreaker. It's like, whoa, you've already started. Like an icebreaker should warm people's brains up to what you're talking about. It should set the tone for contribution. It should get people excited for the meeting, that whatever is happening next. It's not a like, share your favorite color M&M. Now we'll talk about quarterly numbers. If you're in a corporate context, or like, go meet a classmate and do a funny handshake. And then I'm going to teach you about chemistry in a educational context. It's like, whoa, no. It's actually tied to purpose, ideally. So in a one-to-one, in a mentoring context, COVID taught me this lesson, which is when we all went remote for a couple years, we were forced to be more deliberate about our connection, or else it didn't happen because there was no like hallway conversation. There wasn't a few minutes beforehand. It was like everybody clicks the link in the exact moment we pop up and we're like, okay, let's get started. And so if you didn't want to do that, if you knew there was value in connection, you had to say something to initiate and facilitate that connection originally. And I'd say the same logic applies to a mentoring relationship. I like organic bananas, but they don't last nearly as long as inorganic bananas. And so if you try to organically let connection just happen in a mentoring relationship, it might. And it might not, and that relationship might rot very quickly. And so I would much rather genetically modify the conversation or be intentional about how I design that conversation. So coming in, even when I'm meeting with a client one-on-one, I'm coming in and saying, hey, I thought about who you are and what you're up to in the world. And I picked a question for us to just kick off with some connection before content that will get us rolling. And I'll take my own medicine and answer as well. Like that exact phrase I've said many, many, many times to clients. And oftentimes I'll hold up a question, like the workshop I'm leading in a couple hours with a few people that are here, actually. This will be one of our connection before content questions. I'm not going to let you read it, though. Yeah, there you go. Wow.
Yeah,
I forgot about the banana thing.
I love it. We should call it like pesticide-free connection or something. That's awesome.
I love it.
So we've been spending a lot of time at CME thinking about virtual connection because, one of the things that COVID taught us, COVID first hit, first 6 months, companies were like, let's wait till we can all be together again before we engage in mentoring. Because otherwise, how are we ever going to connect? And what we learned, of course, is that virtual mentoring is not just, a Band-Aid, but it really can be incredible connection. And so I'm wondering about your own thoughts on virtual conversations and how they differ from in-person conversations and what we can do to really bridge that gap to make virtual connections and conversations count.
So put these in a couple categories. Every year, I take on 2 to 3 mentees who are kind of outside my normal scope of what I teach and lead workshops and speak on, and are people who are building their own practice as a speaker, author, mentor, coach, etc. And so every year, you just kind of quietly take on 2 to 3 people. A majority, I shouldn't say majority, we communicate a lot asynchronously. And that, I think, is one of the magical things about mentoring, is that it bleeds into like relevant moments. And so I'm inviting this one guy who I'm mentoring right now, pushing him to create his own card deck to help simplify leadership and make it a little bit more concrete. And that's the aim of his card deck. And he just finished a little rough design. And so right before we hopped on this call, he sent me a couple screenshots of the cards, and I can right then record an audio message and give him feedback while I'm walking somewhere, or I can type him a quick response or send him a screenshot with a couple tweaks. And so first of all, it's like, don't underestimate the power of asynchronous conversation, because you can do a ton of stuff that you can't do really that well live. And so you can get some really thoughtful, pointed mentoring in a volley, because that person has a bit of time to think. They can pull up a link that's relevant for you. They can do all the stuff that, like, if you're in a live conversation, all you have is spontaneity. But that's a lot. Like, spontaneity is pretty great. We should keep it around. It's one of the magical things that we as humans can do, and we should never, in my humble opinion, let it go. So if you're virtually communicating with somebody, I would say, like any relationship, setting a couple guidelines that you both consent to ahead of time, of like, hey, when we meet, be in as quiet and focus of a place as possible. When we meet, personally, let's see if I can screen share this. It's a little funky. Let me do something real quick on my Zoom to make this work. I'm going to hide non-video participants. So here's one of my absolute favorite tips for one-to-one mentoring conversations. And that is, if you're on Zoom, so this is how I'm seeing you in the top. So this is my Zoom screen. In the top right corner, you click these buttons, and there's this very magical underutilized button called Hide Self View. And so, oh my goodness, if you're in a one-on-one or one-on-3 conversation, click Hide Self View. Once you did your hair, make sure you're framed, blah, 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 or lack of hair. And now you're purely present with the other person. Can you imagine a mentoring conversation in person out at coffee, except as the mentor, you hired somebody to stand behind you with a full-length mirror and show your mentee being in conversation with you at the coffee shop. It's like super distracting. Takes at least 20% of your brain process and makes you wonder if you should do this with your hands or this with your hands or whatever else. And so that's a big one, turn off self-view. But that's just, one example. Agree to some rules that are going to make the conversation focused and present, more so than in person. I'm curious for you, Lisa, what you've found related to that.
A lot of what you've said. I love the hiding the self-view. Staying in conversation is really important, and that doesn't necessarily, as you say, mean live conversation. It means have additional touch points, or I should say stay in relationship, not stay in conversation, stay in relationship. So it means I found an article that I'm thinking of, and so I send to you, or I know you had a big presentation, and I send you a text and say, hey Chad, thinking of you today, hope how the presentation go, keep me posted. Or I see something in my social media feed that reminds me of a conversation that we had, or what have you. It's continuing to have those touch points and not letting perfect communication be the enemy of good conversation, right? You may not have a half an hour, you may not have a full hour. You also need to have grace that the kids are going to run around in the background and the dog's going to bark and the guy's going to water the lawn or mow the lawn just as you get out of conference. Grace with each other and ability to do it. One of the most exciting phenomena with a lowercase p that I saw during early COVID was mentoring pairs who would do virtual walk and talks. They would each put on their earbuds and they would each go for walks. One's in North Carolina and one's in Singapore. And they're just having their mentoring conversation as they walk because they need to get out of the house. They've been cooped up. It's that kind of innovation for communication that really can be transformative for virtual conversations. And I've seen create relationships that in some ways probably are enhanced beyond what it would be if it would be solely.
Yeah, it's like I was actually working with North Dakota State University and was inviting them to do walk and talks as a part of, they were doing like group Zoom calls. And I was like, pair people up into breakouts of 2 and tell them to switch to their phones or exchange numbers, however you want to do it, and tell people to go walk. But it's like, it's February in North Dakota. We can't just walk around. I was like, pacing in a circle in your room while you're not staring at an LCD screen is useful, is really useful. And so it doesn't need to be a long walk outside if you have restrictions around that. So yeah, walking is gold. Some of my best conversations for sure happen when I'm walking. In fact, even my wife and I have noticed sometimes that like we know each other quite well. We've been married for 10 years and we most of the time very much overread into each other's nonverbals. And we realized at one point we have really good conversations when we drive. And it's because we're not overreading each other's nonverbals, trying to assume or intuit what the other person's feeling. We're just having a freaking conversation. And it's so useful sometimes to be able to actually just like turn your video off and just listen, just tune into one medium as opposed to like having these distracting hand motions and whatever else in your face.
Just you wait till your kids are teenagers. The best conversations happen in the car for exactly the reason that you're talking about. So, okay.
Do you want a really cool tip? This is a moment of informal mentoring. I swim in the mornings, Tuesdays, Thursdays. I swim with this like adult swim team in Pittsburgh. And there's a guy named Frank. He's much older. His kids are out of college. And he said, I have one of the most essential pieces of parenting advice for you. Cause I've got little kids, 3.5 years old and 8 months. And he said, when you're driving them around, always be, if they play sports, be the assistant coach, because you don't really have to do anything, but you get to be involved in their life. And always offer to drive your kid and their friends anywhere they want to go. And when they're sitting in the back, go to the little volume fader and turn the music up real loud in the back, but off in the front. So you can hear what they're saying, but they don't know you can hear what they're saying. And no matter what you hear, don't ever say anything to them until much later. It was like, is that like not kind of
brilliant? That's brilliant. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Your advice comes a few years too late for me, but we'll pass that on. Fantastic. All right. Well, we're coming a little bit to the end of of our scheduled time. I want to make sure that there's time for questions. I know you're working on some amazing stuff on AI. So can you give us a quick explanation? Whatever, my words are failing me. Demo. Yeah. Thank you. That's the word I'm looking for. A quick demo of what you're working on with AI.
Yep. So super enamored by ChatGPT. Have been using it. I wasn't just like, whoa, this is amazing, and then set it collecting dust. Like I'm using it every single day in what I'm doing and really enjoying it. But I also realized it's designed to give you answers. And so I hired a group of developers to help create the opposite of ChatGPT, an AI that is only designed to ask you questions. And in particular, I've been doing this work around how questions help actually shape our future. And the questions you ask actually allow you or somebody else to quite literally talk their way into tomorrow. And so if I can pull this up and Lisa, if you just want to demo it with me live, created this little chat bot called Tomorrow. And you can go, the demo is available at talkwithtomorrow.com. It's like the super alpha. So I'm not even like really releasing this super widely yet. But the idea is that you're just in a conversation with Tomorrow. And this just frames up a little bit of context that I just did verbally. And the first question that it's going to invite you to reflect on is, what aspect of your future would you like to reflect on? So Lisa, if you want to share your answer, I'll type it in. And what the spot's going to do is just going to ask you a series, or what it's intended to do. We're still working on it, but what it's intended to do is ask you a series of personalized questions to just push your thinking, add a little bit of clarity, and perhaps inspire some action. So what aspect of your future would you like to reflect on?
What does life look like once the kids are graduated and gone?
What my life will look like after my kids are graduated, gone, and out of the house. Does that seem fair?
Yes, sir.
All right. So what it's going to do, it's going to use its little large language model, AI thinking brain, and churn up a question. What values and passions will you prioritize and pursue once your children are no longer living at home?
How about travel and learning another language?
Travel and learning another language. This is a lovely example too of connection before content, of like, this bot is going to ask you better questions the more context it has, or at least that's how it's designed to. So this is what I don't like about the bot right now, and I'll stop the demo here. What I don't love about the bot is that it tends to push people toward action too much and too fast. And so I actually like trying to train this bot, this artificial intelligence, to coach / mentor someone. We can just differentiate between those in a minute, but to train it to ask questions, I'm realizing what I did is take the history of a bunch of conversations and pasted them into ChatGPT and asked what percentage of the questions asked are inviting action. And right now the bot is like 50%, which is way too much. As a mentor, it's like, whoa, I don't have nearly enough thinking or feeling or buy-in around this idea to take any action at all. And so asking for action is really just a waste of human effort. But anyway, that's what I'm doing. Talk with tomorrow. I'd love feedback on it. It offers a place to leave some feedback afterward, I believe. Avril in the chat, Chad GPT. I should see if that domain's available. It's almost certainly not.
That's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. All right. So in the time that we have left, it'll be no surprise for those who know Chad that he came up with an innovative way to end our thought leader conversation, which is to do a lightning round. So we have 4 questions. I'm going to kind of lob each one up. Chad's going to answer, and then he'll lob it to me. How do you be a great mentor?
I think you just straight up give advice, not even like option. I think sometimes you just actually advise people like, I think this is the best path. And the phrase that I would introduce for that is my current best thinking, right? Because mentors don't have all the right answers, but I think mentors, when they speak from a place and begin sentences with the phrase, my current best thinking is, and then they give you that, like, it's kind of a cheat code to life. Like mentors that have told me, like, skip this, just do this. Like when you're in a conversation with a client about money, just use this phrase. And it's like, I've used that phrase for the last 10 years. Thank you, Rod Lee. Right. And so it's like that kind of stuff is like really, really valuable.
Okay. So my answer is a little different. I think I would build on your answer, which is another tip that I learned from you in one of your videos, is to start with for me. For me, I would do such and such, and then I would finish with a question. If you're inclined to give advice, how might that look different for you? Or what am I missing, right? Or whose perspective do we need to add here? So give your best advice, but always follow up with a question to make sure that it's something that lands authentically.
Yeah. So that I need to give credit for that for me to a woman named Meg Bolger, who created Safe Zone Project and a couple of other these cool facilitator cards. But that was actually shared in the context of those 2 words being really good to stretch people into being more inclusive. So, right, so this is really expensive for me. This is not expensive for me. And you realize, when I say this is expensive or not expensive, it's different for other people. And so just like a reminder to tag on to the end of sentences, which is great to tag on to for advice. I love that, Lisa.
Beautiful.
Okay, number 2.
Okay, next one. What skills do you gain from mentoring?
So in some ways, this setup was I was mentoring a group by sharing some ideas in response to questions that you asked. And what I learned as I went through is like, I never quite articulated the organic versus genetically modified banana analogy in terms of connection and like letting your connections rot. And so I learn language, and similar to how a comedian does a whole bunch of small sets to test out jokes and be like, oh gosh, no one laughed at this one 3 times in a row. We're going to kill it. And then by the time they get to the arena, all their jokes are amazing, or most of their jokes are really amazing because they've tested them. And so similarly, when you're mentoring and you can see the impact over time, you're like, this just seems to work. People remember this. All my students have texted me or called me a year, 2 year, 10 years later and told me this was really valuable. So I should repeat it over and over.
Yeah.
That's one thing that you learn when you're mentoring.
There's so many things, right? I mean, I think one of the things that I think is the best benefit of mentoring for mentors is this ability to expand your leadership, your own leadership skills by gaining additional perspectives. Great mentors are great listeners. Great mentors can really create the sense of empathy and compassion where they can step in their mentees' shoes and start to see things differently. And we hear over and over again from mentors that they started to see their own career differently. They started to see their own organization differently, and they could really lead better because of that expanded perspective. Super exciting benefit of this relationship.
One of the old school founders or like godfathers of AI, who I'm forgetting his name, Robert Shank, something like that. He just passed away recently. Anyway, it doesn't matter. He described intelligence one time as the number of cases you have in your brain. And so it's like somebody with 40 years of education experience has taught so many students that when they see a new student, they're like, oh, you kind of remind me of Robbie. And this worked really well for Robbie. And so I'm going to apply that here. And so the idea of just like racking up the number of cases is a really good way to get smarter, of just like, tell me more about this instance. Tell me more about this instance. So I've been mentoring myself by just taking this one question on a quest, which is, as a parent, how do you deal with technology and cell phones? And so I've racked up probably 50 cases of how different sets of parents have managed their tech. And I've got a few that I think are like really, really wise. And I don't know yet because I haven't tried it out. But that number, my hope is that number of cases is useful when it comes time to actually put it to work.
Love that. I love that. Okay. So how does an adult find a mentor when there's not a formal mentoring program?
Click open 10, if they're not a student, click open 10 LinkedIn tabs and find something you're naturally, genuinely curious about that person, somebody that you would like to meet or potentially be mentored by. Maybe even let's lower the bar, not even be mentored by, but you'd like to learn something from this person. And click open 10 other tabs, follow your natural curiosity and send them a message with a single question asking for their advice or perspective related to some curiosity that you have. And ideally for me, I like to make sure that it's fairly low commitment to them. So the question, will you be my mentor, is not a low commitment question. It's like right beneath, will you get married? Will you marry me? And so reaching out and saying, hey, I noticed that you worked for blank organization for 5 years. I'm wondering if you could go back 10 years from now and apply for a job, what's something that you'd really want to be deliberate about doing as you're applying for that job? Just like pretty easy to answer. They're probably going to be happy to offer. And chances are they might even click your profile and check out who the heck is asking a question like that. Because usually people are just sending automated messages trying to sell you stuff on LinkedIn.
Yeah, no, that's great. My answer is actually a precursor to that answer, which is to ask a different question. Don't ask the question who. The first question you need to be asking when you want to find a mentor is what? What is it that I want to learn? What is it that I need from mentoring? What is it that I'm looking for? What are the qualities of a mentor that I want to find? And then you can go to LinkedIn and open your 10 tabs. But if you don't know that first, then you are creating a relationship. Then you are looking for a mentoring that is not founded on learning. And learning is the purpose, the process, and the product of mentoring. So you need to first really think about what it is that you want to be learning and what it is you need from mentoring before you open the 10 tabs.
Virtual high five for that one. That was brilliant. Love it.
Thank you. Okay. Well, last question. What is the difference between mentoring and coaching?
I'm going to answer a question with, go back to my milk here. I'm going to answer a question with a question, which is, on a scale of 1 to 10, does the answer to that question matter?
Mm. That's
I don't know the
bold.
answer to that, but
That's
I'm like,
bold.
if we solved it, if we figured it out, we were like, aha, this is the difference between coaching and mentoring. I do think there are differences, and they're probably little t truths different for everybody. And so the idea of like getting the whole world to come to an agreement of what coaching and mentoring is, like, I'd rather do something else.
I love it. I love it. I love the boldness. I have a much more practical mentoring discipline answer, which I'm sure does not surprise you, which
I'm excited to hear
is
it.
that there are 3 characteristics of a mentoring relationship. There's the reciprocity, co-creation, and learning. And in coaching, you don't have the reciprocity and the co-creation. You still have the learning, but you don't have the co-creation of the relationship, and you don't have the reciprocity. It's not that coaches don't benefit, right? But it's that the purpose of the relationship isn't as the reciprocity that is a mentoring relationship. And we could go so much deeper on that one topic right now. I just want to say, first and foremost, thank you, Chad. I love this conversation. As I say, I think we could keep going. And maybe someday you'll agree to do a part 2. I think I've told you this personally before, but for everybody else's benefit, if you haven't checked out Chad's YouTube channel and you're interested in creating connection and meaning in conversation, highly, highly, highly recommend recommend that as well. Danielle, yes, coaches do benefit, but it's the purpose is not the reciprocity of the relationship. So thanks for that comment as well. Chad, again, thank you. Thank you everybody for joining us. We are taking a July break because I'm off for a month. But in August, we are going to resume our thought leader conversations with speaker TBD then. So hope to see you back then. Thank you all for joining.
See ya. Thanks, Lisa.